Ladies and gentlemen, some truths are not written in books. They are lived, quietly, in the deep spaces between public triumphs and private moments that no one ever sees. Every extraordinary life has a hidden architecture, a network of relationships that shape the mind, fuel ambition, and build the quiet resilience behind every public victory. What most people misunderstand about powerful relationships, especially those tied to people who live at the edge of human possibility, is that they are not purely emotional. They are neurological, psychological, and profoundly biological. When someone carries an extraordinary mission on their shoulders, love itself ceases to be a simple emotion. It becomes a form of propulsion. When I speak of a mysterious relationship, I am not talking about scandal nor spectacle. I am talking about the profound, quiet, intensely complex bonds that operate beneath the surface. Bonds that neither journalists nor headlines can ever fully map. Because at their core, such relationships are not built on mere attraction or chemistry. They are built on shared neural states, on the alignment of vision, rhythm, and energy. The brain, after all, is not just an organ of thought. It is a social device, wired over millennia to connect, to synchronize, to co-create. Neuroscience has shown us something remarkable. When two people experience a deep bond, their neural oscillations begin to synchronize. This means their brains, quite literally, start to operate on a similar wavelength. Functional MRI scans in high-trust pairs, founders, long-term partners, visionary collaborators, reveal striking patterns. Their prefrontal cortexes light up in harmony during shared problem solving. Their limbic systems pulse with mirrored emotional activity. It's not just metaphor when people say they are the same wavelength. It's a measurable, physical phenomenon, and in the life of someone who lives at an extreme edge, who builds empires, launches rockets, bends industries, this neural alignment becomes rarer, and therefore infinitely more valuable. Every relationship that truly matters carries an unseen scaffolding of shared intention. But when your world is full of noise, when your mind is always stretched between the stars and the earth, finding that kind of connection feels almost impossible. It's like trying to hear a single violin in the roar of 1,000 engines. Yet, it is in that rare silence between revolutions that the deepest relationships are born, not in the spotlight, but in the quiet corridors of human complexity. When I think about what makes such a relationship mysterious, it's not that it's hidden from the public. It's that the inner logic of it cannot be decoded by the public. People look at external actions. A glance at a launch pad, a dinner, a quiet hand held on a tarmac, and they build a story around it. But the real story is happening in the brain, a continuous, evolving neural dance between two minds that operate on different, but somehow complementary frequencies. One of the most fascinating discoveries in effective neuroscience over the last 2 decades is how emotional intensity modulates memory consolidation. When someone experiences profound attachment, the amygdala, that tiny almond-shaped region deep in the brain, acts like a signal amplifier. It tells the hippocampus, this matters. Store it, protect it. This is why some bonds never fade even when years pass, why some connections seem to outlive logic, distance, or reason. In powerful, visionary lives, such bonds do not weaken under pressure. They become part of the mental architecture that sustains everything else. But here's the paradox. The very forces that make someone extraordinary also make ordinary relationships nearly impossible. Extreme ambition, high cognitive load, relentless schedules, these alter brain chemistry over time. Chronic exposure to high stress states can shift baseline cortisol levels, reshape the anterior cingulate cortex, and modify oxytocin signaling. This means that forming and maintaining deep bonds requires a different kind of resilience. Not soft, but sharp. Not passive, but active and adaptive. Let me give you an example that has nothing to do with fame, but everything to do with how high demand environments shape human attachment. In studies of neurosurgeons, astronauts, and deep space mission planners, researchers found that long-term relational bonds in these individuals follow an unusual curve. Instead of peaking early and tapering off, these bonds deepen slowly, often over years of shared silent understanding. They are not built on constant presence, but on trust so implicit that presence is not always required. This is what gives such relationships their mysterious quality. Outsiders see only fragments. Insiders feel the full architecture. Now, in the context of someone whose life oscillates between building humanity's future and facing relentless public scrutiny, these dynamics intensify. A relationship in such a life cannot be based solely on comfort. It must also withstand velocity. Imagine your brain operating at the edge of cognitive bandwidth, simultaneously calculating orbital trajectories, negotiating global partnerships, and envisioning multi-generational futures. Love in such a space is not merely a romantic interlude, it becomes an anchor. It's a quiet gravitational center around which everything else orbits. And yet, even anchors must move. They must adapt to tides of ambition. That is where the mystery deepens. Such a relationship is often felt more than shown. The public doesn't see the conversations at 3 a.m. when a human being, despite all their power, whispers their fears to someone who actually listens. The public doesn't hear the silence between two people who understand without speaking. The public doesn't feel the neurochemical signature of trust that forms after years of holding the line against the world. We now know from advanced imaging studies that when two individuals develop this kind of deep trust, their vagus nerve responses synchronize. Their heart rates subtly entrain, micro-expressions align. What looks from the outside like effortless calm is actually an exquisitely calibrated neurobiological symphony. And when one of those individuals is carrying the weight of multiple civilizations on their shoulders, metaphorically or literally, the importance of that symphony becomes immeasurable. This is why some of the most transformative relationships in history have been enigmatic. Not because they were scandalous, because they were structurally incomprehensible to those who hadn't lived inside their frequency. A true partner in such a life is not a spectator. They are part of the operating system. I want to tell you something that most people don't realize: extreme vision requires emotional infrastructure. The brain is not a machine that runs on logic alone. The prefrontal cortex may build rockets, but it is the limbic system that gives those rockets meaning. Emotional regulation is not a luxury, it's a strategic asset. For every sleepless night spent solving engineering problems, there must be a counterweight of quiet human connection. Not for sentimentality, but for neurobiological sustainability. In the lab studying human attachment resilience, we've seen this clearly. When individuals face continuous high cognitive and emotional load, those who maintain one or two deeply synchronized relationships, romantic or otherwise, show a dramatically lower risk of burnout, neural fatigue, and disordered stress responses. Their brains display a remarkable pattern. Despite extreme external chaos, their internal neural oscillations remain stable. It's as if the bond itself acts as an emotional gyroscope, keeping the mind from tilting into collapse. And that is why the public will always find such relationships puzzling. They will try to fit them into conventional narratives: who's in, who's out, what happened. But these questions miss the point entirely. The true story is invisible. It lives in the neural harmony between two minds who have learned to find silence together in the middle of a storm. In one of the most fascinating experiments on neural coupling, researchers placed two individuals in separate rooms. They gave one of them an emotionally intense story to tell. The other, who had never heard it before, listened. Over time, their brain activity began to mirror each other with astonishing precision, almost as if the listener's brain was recreating the speaker's experience. This is the core of what happens in a mysterious relationship. It's not about performance. It's about shared mental space. The people who live extraordinary lives often find this level of connection with very few, sometimes only once. And when they do, it becomes a quiet constant. Even if the world doesn't see it, even if circumstances shift, the neural trace remains. Because the brain doesn't simply delete profound attachment. It archives it in the hippocampus, in emotional memory, in subtle pathways that shape every decision that follows. But here's where it becomes even more interesting. High-performing individuals, visionaries, builders, explorers, often compartmentalize emotion to protect their mission. On the surface, they may seem detached, distant, even cold. But beneath that surface, emotional circuits are often far more intense than most people realize. The amygdala doesn't quiet down just because someone builds rockets. In fact, it often roars louder. And in the absence of someone who understands how to navigate that intensity, it can turn inward, becoming both fuel and burden. This is why mystery isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's simply necessary. A truly deep bond, in this kind of life, cannot survive constant public interpretation. It must exist behind the curtain, where trust breathes freely, not hidden out of shame, but out of protection. Out of the understanding that some frequencies can only be heard in silence. As a neuroscientist, I can tell you with certainty human attachment is one of the most complex and beautiful systems in the known universe. It is both delicate and resilient, ephemeral and enduring, and when it intersects with extraordinary ambition, it evolves into something rare, something that defies conventional explanation. This is the quiet architecture behind every so-called mysterious relationship. It is not built on spectacle. It is built on neural precision, emotional endurance, and silent trust. And if we look closely, not at gossip, but at human behavior, we see a pattern. The moments of stillness before a massive launch. The rare smiles that are not for cameras, but for one pair of eyes. The way a hand lingers half a second longer than expected. These micro moments are not random. They are signatures of synchronization. As the years unfold, such a bond doesn't disappear when circumstances change. It morphs. It becomes a reference point. A guiding star in the neural sky. You can build companies, empires, or entire futures, but the architecture of a profound connection remains imprinted, like gravity itself. Even in its silence, it speaks. There's something quietly poetic about how the brain remembers love that the world never fully saw. Neuroscientists have mapped how emotional imprints persist over time. Long after the visible relationship may shift form, a bond forged in an environment of extraordinary ambition doesn't simply vanish. It embeds itself in the brain's predictive models of the world. Every decision, every calculated risk, every intuitive leap thereafter is filtered through the subtle trace of that connection. The orbit of the mind shifts, even if no one else can detect the movement. What makes this even more fascinating is how such relationships act as stabilizers. We often imagine resilience as a trait, a fixed quality of character. But biologically, resilience is a network phenomenon. It emerges from interaction. A brain in isolation reacts differently to stress than a brain in connection. When two individuals share a synchronized attachment, their nervous systems begin to co-regulate. One heartbeat steadies another. One breath slows the storm in someone else's chest. This co-regulation is not symbolic, it's measurable. It lowers systemic stress responses, reduces inflammatory markers, enhances cognitive flexibility. That is not just love, that is physiology. For someone standing at the intersection of technology, vision, and relentless pressure, such a bond can mean the difference between breaking and bending. When the world expects constant innovation, relentless clarity, and superhuman endurance, what sustains the mind is often not strategy, but the soft, invisible architecture of trust. That's why, behind every seemingly unstoppable force, there's usually someone, sometimes only one person, who knows how to speak in silence. The mystery that surrounds such a relationship is not accidental. It is necessary. Public narratives operate in binary. Are they together or not? Are they seen or unseen, official or unofficial? But the brain doesn't work in binary when it comes to attachment. It holds nuance. It holds layered timelines. It keeps signals even when the world moves on. A mysterious bond, therefore, can exist in multiple states at once, visible and invisible, past and present, personal and strategic. Think of it this way. In astrophysics, we talk about gravitational fields. A planet doesn't have to be visible to exert pull. Its gravity shapes orbits, bends trajectories, influences other bodies. In human life, deep attachment functions the same way. The person may not always be in the frame, but their gravitational signature remains. They continue to shape thought patterns, emotional resonance, and future choices, often without a word spoken. This is why when people look at extraordinary individuals and ask, who is behind them? They often misunderstand the question. It's not about who stands behind them physically. It's about who lives inside their neural architecture, whose presence has become part of the way their brain orients itself in the world. That's what gives a relationship its enduring mystery. It's not just a story. It's a force field. When neuroscientists measure brain activity during profound attachment, they often observe something astonishing in the default mode network. The brain's system of internal thought and self-referential processing. People in deep, long-term connection display greater coherence in this network when they think of or interact with their attachment figure. This means the relationship literally shapes how they perceive themselves. When that relationship involves someone living an extraordinary, high-velocity life, the effect magnifies. Their identity is not built alone. It's built in tandem, one mind intertwined with another, even when the world can't see the threads. But here's the harder truth. The same intensity that gives such a bond its strength also makes it fragile. In lives defined by speed, scale, and relentless evolution, relationships are exposed to stressors most people never encounter. Shifting geographies, global attention, massive time demands, asymmetrical pressures. All of these distort the normal rhythms of attachment. The mystery isn't only in how these relationships endure, but in how they adapt to forces trying to unmake them. Some collapse under the weight. Others, paradoxically, grow more silent, more resilient, more deeply embedded in the nervous system. In long-term studies of high-performing individuals, attachment patterns show remarkable diversity. Some relationships burn like a flare, intense, brief, unforgettable. Others move underground, invisible but indestructible. And a rare few evolve into something entirely different, an enduring neural signature that transcends categories like together or part. This isn't romance in the conventional sense. It's a kind of human physics. Imagine two minds shaped by shared purpose, wired by time, fused by trust. Even when external structures shift, their gravitational field remains. That is what gives such a relationship its quiet power. It does not need a public stage. It does not need to explain itself. It exists in the bloodstream of memory. It's also important to acknowledge the paradox of ambition. To build on a planetary scale, one must carry both extraordinary vision and extraordinary solitude. People often see the vision. They rarely see the solitude. There is a kind of loneliness that lives at the top of complex systems. Not because there aren't people around, but because very few can truly meet you at the altitude where your mind resides. In that altitude, love becomes both a refuge and a risk. A refuge because it offers something real, grounding, human. A risk because it exposes the one place where even the strongest can be undone. That is why when someone with vast ambitions forms a true connection, it's unlike anything most people will ever experience. It's not about companionship alone. It's about finding the one frequency where the noise of the world fades, where two nervous systems align without performance, where the future feels not like a burden, but like something shared. This is rare, and when it happens, it leaves an imprint strong enough to echo for decades. Some of the most transformative human innovations have been born not just from solitary genius, but from relationships that existed far from public scrutiny. The world saw the results. It did not see the conversations at 2 a.m., the shared silences, the trust that allowed someone to leap further, because they knew someone would catch them emotionally if they fell. That is the real story behind the mystery. In the study of human attachment, there's a phenomenon called emotional scaffolding. It refers to the way one person's stability can allow another to build higher, push further, risk more. This is not a metaphor. It's measurable in stress hormone regulation, sleep patterns, cognitive bandwidth, and decision-making clarity. The bond doesn't just make someone feel supported. It literally expands what their brain can handle. This is why so many extraordinary lives are quietly defined by one extraordinary relationship. It might not be declared. It might not be broadcast. But it's there, forming the invisible skeleton on which everything else stands. And when outsiders try to decode it using ordinary language, labels like dating, breakup, partner, they inevitably miss the essence. They're trying to describe gravity with the language of weather. You see, mystery in love is not just about secrecy. It's about complexity. It's about systems so interwoven that they resist simple narratives. This is why some bonds can't be categorized. They don't begin or end like stories. They expand and contract like living organisms, evolving with the people inside them. Sometimes the bond manifests as partnership. Sometimes it becomes distance. Sometimes it hides beneath layers of public misdirection. But always, it hums like a constant signal beneath the noise. For those who carry world-sized visions, this kind of connection is a form of survival. Not because they are weak, but because no mind is designed to carry infinite weight alone. We are wired for attachment. Even the most extraordinary among us remain, at their core, biological creatures who need to synchronize with another heartbeat. In fact, the higher the cognitive altitude, the more vital that human grounding becomes. And so, when people call such a relationship mysterious, what they're really sensing is a frequency they can't quite tune into. A bond that doesn't fit their expectations. They look for signs, photos, statements, appearances, but the real story is happening inside two nervous systems, in quiet glances and unspoken understandings, in neural entrainment and emotional memory. One of the most moving findings in attachment neuroscience involves the persistence of physiological synchrony, long after visible contact has faded. Even years later, when people are exposed to subtle reminders of their profound bond, a scent, a sound, a certain environment, their autonomic systems respond as if the connection is still present. That is the definition of mystery, something that lives beyond time and narrative. This is also why these bonds are rarely explained. They don't need explanation. Explanation would reduce their complexity. They live best in the space between language and silence. Now imagine what it means to live with such a bond, while simultaneously driving technological revolutions, challenging industries, carrying the expectations of nations, even civilizations. It becomes not just a relationship, but a private orbit, something that holds the psyche together when the external world is too loud to bear. It doesn't matter what outsiders think. It doesn't matter what stories they invent. The truth lies between two people, in the way their neurons still recognize each other, even in silence. This is the secret behind every so-called mysterious relationship. It isn't built on public performance. It isn't validated by photographs or interviews. It's built in the quiet, in the profound neural and emotional alignment of two human beings navigating an extraordinary existence. And maybe that is why, even in the most technologically advanced futures we can imagine, love remains the most complex system we've ever encountered. We can map galaxies. We can colonize other worlds. But we still cannot fully explain why two minds find each other, synchronize, and never entirely let go. Because at the end of every empire, every invention, every launch, there is still a human heartbeat. And behind that heartbeat, often, there is another, quiet, steady, mysterious, that has been there all along. Every extraordinary life leaves two trails, the visible one the world celebrates, and the invisible one it will never fully understand. The visible trail is filled with milestones, products, companies, revolutions, and events that shape history. The invisible one is made of whispers, late, night conversations, silent rooms, moments of shared humanity that never make it to a camera lens. It's in that invisible trail that the deepest bonds live. And it is there, in that private orbit, where true strength is born. This is something scientists are only beginning to measure with precision: how attachment energy sustains cognitive endurance. We used to believe willpower was a solitary function of the brain, something generated purely by the individual. But the more we map the neural circuitry of resilience, the more we see that connection isn't an accessory to ambition. it is part of its engine. Attachment enhances dopamine regulation, stabilizes prefrontal activity under stress, and builds something we call adaptive neural endurance. This is the quiet science behind human greatness. People often imagine that those who build at scale must be fueled by sheer determination, an endless reservoir of personal drive. But the truth is more subtle, more human. Even the most relentless visionaries depend on connection, sometimes to just one person, to keep their mind from fracturing under pressure. That person becomes a psychological constant, an emotional reference point, a stabilizing force. And because that bond exists far away from the noise, it appears mysterious to everyone else. But to the two people inside it, it is the most logical, the most essential, the most real thing in the world. There's a certain kind of conversation that happens in these bonds that outsiders will never hear. It's not dramatic. It's quiet. It's not about titles or labels. It's about shared understanding at a level so deep it doesn't require words. When a person operating at the edge of human capacity finds someone who understands that language, it doesn't matter if the world knows. That connection is not built to be understood by crowds. It's built to survive them. And this is where the science and the soul intersect. Emotional synchrony, vagal tone regulation, neural oscillation coupling, these are real, measurable phenomena. But the way they manifest in the lives of extraordinary people transcends data points. It becomes the unseen story beneath everything else. A bond like this becomes not only emotional but strategic, not in a calculating way, but in a way that allows one human mind to remain human, while the world demands it to be machine. Like, when someone builds something that reshapes civilization, the pressure is not romantic, it's crushing. The world wants certainty, strength, clarity, all the time. But inside, there are doubts, fears, fatigue, the kind of exhaustion that cannot be fixed by applause. It can only be softened by a voice that doesn't demand an explanation. By the presence of someone who isn't impressed by power, but sees the person beneath it. This is the untold story of many who stand on great stages. They are not alone, because they are surrounded by fans or colleagues or cameras. They are sustained because of a single quiet bond that holds steady no matter what storms arrive. That's the secret. Not a tabloid headline, not a scandal, but a simple, quiet, neurological truth. No matter how far the human mind goes, it still needs another heartbeat to keep its rhythm steady. Think of the most powerful systems we build: rockets, electric engines, complex networks. All of them rely on stabilizers, redundant safety mechanisms, subtle feedback loops that keep them from spinning out of control. The human mind is no different. Behind its grandest trajectories, there must be something, or someone, holding the emotional gyroscope steady. It's rarely loud, it's rarely visible. But without it, even the brightest mind can drift. That's why some relationships don't end when the world thinks they do. They transform. They find new frequencies. They move underground, becoming quieter, harder to detect, but paradoxically more real. In some cases, the bond becomes so deeply woven into identity that removing it would feel like removing a part of the self. And so, it persists, silent, mysterious, enduring. When you look closely at history, you'll find patterns. Behind the greatest leaps in science, art, and innovation, there is often one connection that outlived public explanation. The kind of connection that shaped decisions in invisible ways, that steadied hands in crucial moments, that whispered clarity when the world roared with noise. People will speculate, project, and invent narratives, but they'll never fully touch the core truth, because it was never meant for them. This is why, when we speak of mysterious relationships, we must shift our perspective. Mystery isn't an absence of information. It's a presence of depth too complex to flatten into a headline. It's the part of the story written in a language only two people understand. And sometimes, even words aren't enough. Sometimes, it's encoded in a look across a room, in the echo of a memory, in the gravitational pull of two minds that once synchronized so completely that the world, for a moment, fell away. In the coming decades, as we advance our ability to map the human brain, to simulate emotion, to engineer intelligence. We may get better at describing this kind of bond, but I doubt we will ever fully contain it. Because love, real love, forged in the quiet space between extraordinary lives, isn't just a signal, it's a force. And forces, by their nature, shape worlds without always being seen. So when you hear whispers of someone's mysterious relationship, look beyond the spectacle. What you are really seeing, or rather, not seeing, is the most human part of their story. The part that allowed them to survive their own brilliance. The part that gave them a place to land when the world demanded they fly. And perhaps one day, when the cameras are gone, when the noise fades, and history is written in quieter ink, it won't be the headlines that matter. It will be the invisible orbit. The person who stood in silence, who steadied the mind that changed the world. That is the secret. That is the architecture. That is the quiet, unshakable gravity behind every extraordinary human life. Thank you.